For almost 50 years, Priscilla Presley refused to answer one simple, painful question. Did Elvis regret marrying her? She heard it in whispers at parties, she read it between the lines of magazine headlines, she felt it in the way strangers looked at her when she walked through the gates of Graceland. Some people asked it with curiosity, others asked it with blame. And for decades, she stayed quiet. But now, at 78 years old, sitting with a lifetime behind her and almost everyone from that era gone, Priscilla finally breaks her silence. And the answer she gives is not the fairy tale ending fans were expecting. She doesn't laugh it off. She doesn't give a rehearsed line. She pauses, lets the silence sit there, and then admits that there was a moment in the middle of their marriage when Elvis said something that shook her to her core. A few words that she has carried like a stone in her chest ever since. Words that made her wonder if the man she had built her entire world around secretly wished he had never said, "I do." But here, where it gets even more complicated. Because when Priscilla finally explains what happened that night, she doesn't just expose Elvis' regret. She exposes the cost of being loved by a legend, the weight of being turned into a symbol, and the heartbreak of realizing that your marriage was never really just about two people in love. It was about a machine, an image, and a world that never once asked what she wanted. And suddenly that simple question, did he regret marrying her, isn't simple anymore. Was Elvis regretting her? Was he regretting the marriage? Or was he regretting the life that made love almost impossible to hold onto? By the time you reach the end of her story, the wedding photos, the Graceland memories, the smiling pictures with baby Lisa Marie, they all feel different. Softer in some ways, sharper in others. Because behind every iconic image of Elvis and Priscilla standing side by side, there was a young woman trying to be enough for a man who belonged to the entire world. And a man who, deep down, sometimes wondered if he had any right to ask her to live in that world with him at all. Tonight, we're not here to gossip. We're not here to tear anyone down. We're here to listen to a 78-year-old woman look back on the most complicated love of her life and finally tell the truth about the marriage Elvis regretted. Because to understand what he really felt and what she really lived through, you have to see past the white dress, the Vegas glamour, the flashbulbs, and the fan fantasy. You have to hear the words he said when the cameras were gone and the crowd had gone home, and Elvis Presley was just a tired man, alone in his house, talking to the woman who knew him better than anyone. You have to hear the moment when he looked at Priscilla and said something she never forgot. And that's where our story begins. He was the king of rock and roll. She was the quiet teenager who somehow ended up in his orbit. To the world, Priscilla Presley's story sounds like a dream. The girl who caught Elvis' eye in a foreign country, the long-distance love, the breathtaking wedding, the life inside Graceland. For millions of fans, she became the symbol of Elvis' great love story. His only wife, the woman who shared his home, his daughter, his most private years. But symbols don't bleed. Symbols don't cry alone in a bedroom when the phone doesn't ring. Symbols don't sit across from a man they adore and listen to him say something that feels like a crack splitting through their whole reality. Priscilla does. That's why this story matters so much more than just, what did Elvis regret? It's about what it means to be loved by someone the world thinks it owns. It's about what happens when a young girl is pulled into a life she didn't design, a marriage that was never fully hers to shape, and a love that had to compete with fame, addiction, exhaustion, and the expectations of millions of strangers. By 78, most people are allowed to belong to themselves. Their mistakes are old news. Their heartbreak is private. Their memories are something they share only if they choose to. Priscilla never had that luxury. From the moment news of her relationship with Elvis went public, her life stopped being hers alone. Every decision, every look, every quote was filtered through one brutal lens. Is she good enough for him? When they married, people called her lucky. When they divorced, some called her ungrateful. When she stayed loyal to his legacy after his death, others questioned her motives all over again. All while carrying a truth about their marriage that she barely talked about out loud. She protected him. She protected their daughter. She protected the image so many people needed to believe in. And somewhere in all of that protection, her own side of the story was pushed down, folded away, and kept behind polite smiles and safe answers. Until now. At 78, Priscilla has outlived Elvis. She has outlived Lisa Marie. She has watched the story of their family get retold, reshaped, and sometimes twisted by people who were never there. And with that distance, with that grief, with that perspective, she finally begins to speak more honestly about what their marriage really was, and what Elvis may have truly regretted. Not from a place of revenge, not from bitterness, but from the quiet clarity that only comes when you've survived the storm and are standing alone on the shore looking back. This is not the story of a villain and a victim. It's not about painting Elvis as a monster or Priscilla as perfect. It's the story of two human beings, deeply flawed, deeply bound to each other, and crushed under the weight of a life that looked magical from the outside and felt suffocating behind closed doors. When you hear the phrase, "the marriage Elvis regretted," it's easy to imagine drama, shouting matches, slammed doors, accusations. But that's not where the real heartbreak lived. The real heartbreak lived in the quiet moments, in the second-guessing, in the way Elvis looked at Priscilla sometimes like she was both his safe place and his greatest guilt. He knew what he had asked her to give up: her youth, her normalcy, her chance at a life where she could walk through a grocery store without being judged for every strand of hair out of place. He knew the promises he couldn't keep. He knew the temptations he couldn't resist. He knew that every time he walked on stage and thousands of women screamed his name, he was inviting a kind of chaos into their home that no ordinary marriage could survive. So when Priscilla finally reveals that he spoke about regret, it isn't as simple as "I regretted marrying you." It's a tangle of guilt, self-loathing, and the realization that he might have dragged someone he loved into a life that would eventually break her heart, and his. And that's what we're going to explore together. We're going to step into their world, not as fans who only see the movie poster, but as witnesses trying to understand the human beings behind it. We're going to sit with the young girl in Germany who fell for a lonely soldier. We're going to follow her to Graceland, into a palace filled with music and laughter and secrets. We're going to listen to the subtle ways Elvis tried, and often failed, to be both a husband and a myth. Most importantly, we're going to listen to Priscilla herself. Because for so long, her voice was the one thing missing from the narrative. People spoke about her. They speculated, judged, romanticized. They turned her into a character in the Elvis legend. But a legend doesn't sit in front of a camera in her late 70s and say, with tears in her eyes, that there was a moment when the man she loved hinted that he might have regretted the life they built together. A woman does, a real woman with real scars. This video isn't about solving a mystery for the sake of drama. It's about offering you a chance to feel something deeper. The weight of promises, the way love can be real and still not be enough, the way a single sentence said in exhaustion can echo for decades in the mind of the person who heard it. So as we step into this story, I want you to do something simple. Forget just for a moment the rhinestones, the jumpsuits, the screaming crowds. Forget the glossy wedding photos and the tabloid headlines. Picture instead two people sitting in a room. The man is tired, heavier with burdens than anyone realizes. The woman is watching him, sensing that something inside him is slipping away, but still hoping he'll reach for her hand and hold on. Now imagine he looks at her and says something that makes her wonder if marrying him was the worst thing he ever did and the hardest thing he ever asked her to endure. That's the moment Priscilla is finally ready to talk about. And to understand how they got there, how a shy teenage girl and the world's biggest star ended up in a marriage that one of them may have quietly regretted, we have to start at the beginning, before the wedding, before the rumors, before the divorce. Back when he was still just Elvis and she was just Priscilla, and neither of them had any idea how much that love would cost them both. He was the king when she met him. Not to her. To Priscilla Beaulieu, he was first just a face in a photograph, a name she heard on the radio in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language and didn't quite feel like she belonged. Her stepfather's military transfer had brought the family to Germany, and overnight everything familiar disappeared. New house, new school, new rules, new loneliness. She was 14, too old to be a child, too young to be taken seriously. Quiet, polite, careful, the kind of girl who kept most of her feelings on the inside. And somewhere not too far away, Elvis Presley was in uniform, stationed overseas, trying to survive a different kind of loneliness. His mother was gone. His fame, as huge as it already was, couldn't protect him from that loss. He was grieving, homesick, and suddenly very aware that no amount of applause could fill the empty chair at his family's table. People around him saw a superstar soldier. Inside, he still felt like a boy from Tupelo who had climbed too fast and lost too much on the way up. The first time Priscilla was invited to meet him, she wasn't starstruck the way people imagine. She was terrified. "What do you say to Elvis Presley? How do you look? How do you act?" Her parents hesitated, then agreed under strict conditions. "Be home at a certain time. Mind your manners. Remember who you are." She walked into that house where Elvis was staying, heart pounding, hands cold. He was older, larger than life, surrounded by friends, music, energy. But when he spoke to her, something shifted. The room didn't feel quite so big anymore. He didn't treat her like a screaming fan. He treated her like someone he could talk to. He asked about home, school, what she liked. He noticed that she was shy, that she watched more than she spoke, and in that quiet he found something he desperately needed, a soft place to land. Those first evenings together weren't wild, romantic movie scenes. They were talks that stretched late into the night. Elvis at the piano, playing songs that mattered to him. Priscilla sitting nearby, listening, absorbing everything. He poured out stories about his mother, about fame, about the pressure, about the ache of being far from Graceland. She didn't have answers. She just listened. And for a man surrounded by people who wanted something from him, that was everything. From her side, it felt like stepping into a dream she hadn't asked for but couldn't turn away from. Every time the phone rang and his voice was on the other end, the world outside her window blurred a little more. School, homework, teenage problems, they all seemed smaller compared to the pull of his attention. She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was the girl Elvis Presley liked. But from the very beginning, there was an imbalance that no one talked about openly. He was a global star in his 20s. She was still in high school. He had already lived a lifetime of experiences. She was just starting to understand who she was. And without realizing it, Priscilla began to let him, and the gravity of his life, shape her. Little by little, she adjusted. She changed how she dressed, how she wore her hair, how she spoke. She tried to be calmer, more mature, more womanly than her age. She learned to read his moods, to sense when he needed cheering up, when he needed silence, when he needed the comfort of someone who would never challenge his world, only enter it gently. The longer their connection continued, the more her life stopped being about her own path and became about orbiting around his. When his military service ended and he prepared to return to America, a different kind of pressure crept in. Not just from him, but from everyone around him. Elvis could not simply go back to being a guy who dated around like any ordinary young man. He was an industry, a symbol. The Colonel cared about image as much as music. The papers wanted a clean, romantic story to offset the rumors. Fans wanted to believe their hero was a gentleman with a good girl waiting for him. Priscilla became that narrative, whether she was ready or not. Back in the States, Elvis, life exploded again. Movies, records, tour co-stars. He was surrounded by beauty, attention, temptation. And yet he kept reaching back across the ocean to this teenage girl in Germany, calling, inviting, promising. To her, those calls were lifelines. To him, they were comfort, stability, and maybe, in some ways, a way to prove to himself that he still had a piece of innocence in his world. After a long struggle and many conversations, her parents agreed to let her visit him in America. But what they didn't realize, and what she barely understood herself, was that this visit was less a vacation and more a step into a life that would consume her. Graceland was not just a house, it was a kingdom, and in that kingdom there were unspoken rules. Priscilla soon learned them. She learned that Elvis had very specific ideas about how he liked his woman to look. Dark hair, dramatic makeup, fitted clothes. He had preferences and people around him reinforced them. A comment here, a suggestion there, a little "you'd look prettier if." And over time, the girl who had once just been Priscilla became more and more what he and his world wanted her to be. She adapted, eager to please, desperate to keep his attention in a sea of distractions. Saying no felt like risking everything. Saying yes felt like love, until it began to feel like losing herself. From the outside, it all seemed romantic, a girl leaving her old life behind to be with the man she loved. From the inside, it was more complicated. Her world shrank down to one address, one man, one role. While other girls her age were figuring out careers, college, independence, she was figuring out how to fit into the schedule of a superstar. Yet despite the cracks, despite the sacrifices, she believed in the story they were building together. She believed that all of this would lead to the moment every woman raised on fairy tales is told to wait for, the wedding, the ring, the day when everything becomes official, permanent, safe. She believed that once she became Mrs. Elvis Presley, the doubts would quiet, the questions would fade, and she would finally know where she stood in his world. What she didn't know was that there were others with their own reasons for wanting that wedding too. The Colonel understood timing better than anyone. Elvis had a new phase coming, new films, new records, a restart of live performances. A wholesome wedding, a loyal wife, a picture-perfect family. It all looked good on posters and in magazines. It promised stability, maturity, a settled Elvis that brands and sponsors could trust. Marriage wasn't just about love, it was a strategic move. For Priscilla, though, it was still about the dream. And when the proposal finally came, it wasn't a long, drawn-out romantic fairy tale. It was more like a decision that had been quietly made around them, slowly closing in, until saying no didn't feel like an option at all. She said yes because of course she did. She loved him. She had already given up so much. Saying no now would have meant tearing her own life apart. The stage was set. The world would see a beautiful bride, a beaming groom, a kiss for the cameras. They would cheer. They would send letters. They would say, "See, it all worked out." But even before the cake was cut, even before the ink dried on the certificate, there were tiny shadows creeping into that perfect picture. Shadows that would grow. Shadows that someday would shape the words Elvis chose when he spoke about regret. And that brings us to the next chapter of their story. Because once the wedding dress is folded away, once the guests go home and the headlines fade, what's left is two people in a house, trying to live a life neither of them really chose on their own terms. That's when the tension began to rise. The wedding itself looked like a dream. Flashbulbs, champagne, elegant outfits, a beautiful young bride on the arm of one of the most famous men in the world. To the cameras, Elvis was charming, smiling, doing all the things a groom is supposed to do. The photographs made it eternal. Their eyes locked, their hands intertwined, the kiss that fans all over the world would stare at on magazine covers. But for many of the people there that day, it didn't feel like an intimate celebration of two souls. It felt controlled, compressed, fast. Some close friends later described it as hurried, almost as though it had been slotted into a schedule rather than allowed to unfold naturally. The guest list was tight. The press was carefully managed. Everything looked perfect, but it felt orchestrated. For Priscilla, it was overwhelming. She was finally, officially his wife. The word sounded huge in her mind. Wife. It meant belonging, security, the end of uncertainty. It meant that all those late nights waiting for him, all the sacrifices, had led to this moment. And yet, when the music quieted and the day turned into night, there were little flickers of something else. A certain heaviness in Elvis, eyes when he thought no one was watching, a tension in his shoulders as he moved through the crowd, a sense that part of him was performing the role of happy groom and part of him was somewhere else entirely. Those flickers were easy to ignore at first. Newlyweds are allowed to be tired, overwhelmed. There were flights to catch, appearances to make, things to do. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks and the spotlight moved on, those flickers became their everyday life. Graceland, once a magical palace to her, became the backdrop for a new kind of routine. Priscilla's days began to revolve around Elvis rhythms. He kept late hours, often staying up all night, sleeping into the afternoon. His schedule was linked to the studio, the stage, the constant demands of people who needed him to be on when the world was watching. She would wait for him to wake up, wait for him to come home, wait for him to be in the right mood. Her own needs slipped quietly into the background. She wasn't going out to find herself, to build a career, to explore her own interests freely. She was maintaining a world that centered around his. From the outside, it looked like luxury. From the inside, it often felt like a beautiful cage. There were parties, yes. Laughter, music, friends dropping by. But there were also long stretches of emptiness when he was away filming, touring, or simply disappearing into his own struggles. In those quiet hours, the reality crept in. She had built her life around a man who was rarely truly present for long periods of time. Elvis, for his part, was being pulled apart by opposing forces. On one side, the world wanted him as an untouchable icon, desired, adored, always available to fantasy. On the other, he was now a husband, and soon, a father. The image of domestic stability clashed constantly with the reality of who the industry needed him to be. On tour, surrounded by adoring fans and an entourage that rarely said no to him, the boundaries of marriage blurred. Temptation wasn't a rare danger. It was a nightly guarantee. And Elvis, with his vulnerabilities and his need for constant stimulation, did not always push that temptation away. For Priscilla, the whispers started early. Rumors of on-set romances, co-stars who got a little too close, women who stayed a little too long after shows. Some stories were exaggerated, some were half-true, some were painfully real. She tried to ignore them, then rationalize them, then confront them in small ways that didn't risk pushing him further away. Each time she swallowed her hurt, another small crack formed inside her. Each time he came home with flowers, apologies, or charm, she glued herself back together a little thinner. The tension wasn't always explosive. It was subtle. The way he'd say, "You knew what this life was," when she tried to express her pain. The way she'd force a smile in front of others, then cry in private. The way both of them, in their own ways, started to feel trapped, he by expectations he could never meet, she by a marriage she had waited her whole life for, only to realize it was slowly dissolving her. When Lisa Marie was born, everything changed, and yet nothing changed at all. Holding their daughter, Priscilla felt a new kind of love, fierce and protective. For a moment, it seemed like this child could be the bridge between them, the thing that brought them closer, that gave their marriage a deeper purpose. And in some ways, it did. There were tender moments, Elvis as a father, softer, more grounded, looking at that tiny life with awe. But the pressures didn't go away. The tour continued. The demands never stopped. The temptations didn't vanish because a baby had arrived. If anything, the stakes became higher. Now every argument, every distance, every broken promise had a little pair of eyes somewhere in the background, even if she was too young to understand. For Elvis, the guilt grew. He loved his daughter. He loved Priscilla in his own complicated way. But he couldn't escape the feeling that he was failing both of them. Failing to be present, failing to be faithful, failing to be the man the world thought he was and the man he sometimes wished he could be. And guilt, when it isn't faced, often turns into restlessness, self-destruction, and withdrawal. He started saying things in unguarded moments that hinted at an inner battle he didn't know how to win. Comments about not being cut out for domestic life. Jokes about how he should have stayed single forever. Offhand remarks that were easy to laugh off in front of a crowd, but hit Priscilla like a knife when they were alone. Was he regretting the marriage? Was he regretting the life around it? Or was he regretting himself, his own inability to live up to the promises he'd made? Priscilla didn't have answers. All she had was the growing feeling that the dream she'd bet everything on was slowly slipping through her fingers. She began, quietly, to carve out small pieces of independence, interests of her own, friendships that weren't entirely controlled by his schedule, a sense of self beyond just being his wife. Those were tiny rebellions, but in a world that had molded her from teenager into Elvis ideal, they were monumental. And Elvis noticed. The more she stepped toward herself, the more he felt the fragile balance shift. This wasn't the girl who had once existed only to comfort him, follow him, adapt to him. This was a woman beginning to realize that love should not cost her entire identity. The tension between them wasn't always shouted. Often it was in the things left unsaid. The glances, the sighs, the silence between questions like, "Are you happy?" and answers like, "Of course," when both of them knew that wasn't the whole truth. All of that, the rushed wedding, the controlled life, the temptations, the loneliness, the guilt, the quiet acts of self-preservation, slowly built to a breaking point. And it's at that breaking point, in a moment behind closed doors, that Elvis would say something to Priscilla she never fully recovered from. A few words that would echo in her mind for decades. Words that, at 78 years old, she would finally feel ready to talk about. Words that would make her ask herself, over and over again, did he regret marrying me? Or did he regret the world we were never strong enough to escape? It happened on a night that, at first, didn't feel any different from 100 others. Graceland was quiet in that heavy way it sometimes was after the chaos. The phones had stopped ringing. The last car had rolled away from the driveway. The laughter from whatever gathering had just ended was fading into echoes in the halls. Priscilla moved through the house like she always did, half out of habit, half out of a need to make sure everything was in its place. Lights off here, door closed there, little acts of control in a life where so much was out of her hands. She knew his moods by now. She could tell the difference between the Elvis who came home buzzing with adrenaline, wanting to talk and joke and play music, and the Elvis who came home heavy, quiet, sick of his own legend, needing something but not knowing how to ask for it. Tonight, he was the second one. He'd just come back from a run of shows or a stretch of filming or another cycle of being pulled apart by everyone who wanted a piece of him. The details blur over time, but the feeling doesn't. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes were tired. There was a kind of dullness in him that even charm couldn't cover. He went into a room they'd retreated to 1,000 times before. A room that had seen laughter, arguments, reconciliations, long silences. She followed gently, as she always did. This wasn't the time for raised voices or accusations. She had learned that never got her anywhere. Instead, she sat nearby, not too close, not too far, close enough to listen if he wanted to talk. For a while, he didn't. He fidgeted, ran his hands through his hair, stared at nothing, made small comments about the tour, the crowds, the noise. You can hear people talk about how thrilling it is to have thousands screaming your name, but what you don't see is the emptiness that sometimes comes after. The way the silence feels even louder. She asked him how he was, not the polite, "How did it go?" the world asked. The quieter question, "How are you?" At first, he brushed it off, said he was fine, said he was tired, said he just needed rest. But his voice had that edge she recognized, the edge that meant there was something else underneath. She could have let it go. She had let it go many times before. But something in her, worn down by years of waiting and wondering, couldn't do that tonight. So she pressed softly. "You don't seem fine," she said. "You've been far away lately." Far away in his eyes, far away in his bed, far away at the dinner table. Her words weren't sharp. They came from a place of hurt, yes, but also fear. Fear that she was losing him in slow motion, that the man sitting a few feet away was already halfway gone. He sighed long and heavy, the kind of sigh that sounded older than he was. "You don't understand," he muttered. She swallowed, "Then help me understand." There was a long pause. In that silence, she felt all the years pressing in around them. Germany, Graceland, the wedding, the birth of their daughter, the nights she'd waited for him, the rumors she'd pretended not to hear, the dreams she'd tried to keep alive even when reality didn't match. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he was talking to himself and she just happened to be there to hear it. "I ain't cut out for this," he said. For a moment, she didn't know what this meant. This conversation, this house, this moment. He didn't leave her guessing for long. Being married, being a husband, being, he trailed off, searching for the word, normal. Her heart tightened. She tried to keep her voice calm. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, frustrated. With himself, with his life, with the world that expected him to be everything to everyone. "I should have never dragged you into this," he said. "You deserved better than this life, better than me always gone, always pulled." Again, he waved a hand as if swatting away a swarm of invisible demands. She heard the self-loathing in his tone, the guilt, the exhaustion. But she also heard something else, a wordless confession. "I should have never dragged you into this." To him, maybe it was a way of saying, "I failed you. I'm not the man you needed me to be." To her, sitting there with her whole youth, her choices, her identity wrapped up in him, it landed like a blow. Did that mean he regretted marrying her? Did that mean the wedding she had dreamed about for years, the life she had reshaped herself to fit into, was a mistake in his mind? She managed to whisper, "Are you saying you regret us?" He closed his eyes for a second, as if the question itself hurt. "I don't regret loving you," he said quietly. "But sometimes I wonder if we should have ever gotten married, if it was fair to you, to me, to any of this." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. He didn't shout, he didn't throw anything. He didn't storm out. It wasn't a dramatic scene you'd see in a movie. It was just a tired man admitting something he'd probably tried not to say out loud for a long time. But to Priscilla, it felt like someone had walked up to the foundation of her life and given it a hard shove. He didn't regret loving her. He did, however, seem to regret what that love had turned into once the ring was on, once the machine of his career had latched onto the image of husband and wife and family man, and twisted it into something even he couldn't live up to. She stared at him, stunned. Part of her wanted to argue, to remind him of the good moments, the laughter, the tenderness. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to say, "I didn't ask for this life either. I was a child when you chose me. I gave up everything for you." But no words came out. In that moment, she saw not Elvis Presley, the star, but a man who truly believed he had ruined things he cared about. A man who didn't know how to change the path he was on. A man who felt that he was poison to the people closest to him. He reached for her hand then, as if to soften what he just said. "You know I love you," he murmured. "You know I love our little girl, that ain't what I'm talking about." But love suddenly didn't feel like enough. Because love had not stopped the late nights alone. Love had not stopped the cheating, the distance, the unpredictability. Love had not protected her from becoming an accessory to his life instead of a partner in it. She nodded because what else could she do in that moment? She touched his arm. She said something like, "I know." Maybe she meant it, maybe she didn't. Maybe she was just trying to keep the walls from collapsing that night. They moved on, the conversation shifted, life continued. But something inside her didn't go back to how it was. A line had been crossed, not through anger or betrayal this time, but through honesty. A brutal, raw honesty that left her with a wound no apology could fully heal. From then on, every argument carried an echo of those words. Every time he disappeared into his work or his worst habits, she heard, "I should have never dragged you into this." Every time she looked at their daughter and thought about the kind of stability she wanted for her, she heard, "Sometimes I wonder if we should have ever gotten married." It didn't all fall apart the next day. That's not how real life works. Real life erodes slowly. They still had moments of closeness. They still had family memories, shared jokes, little rituals that only they understood. But woven through all of it was a thread of doubt. About him, about their future, about how much of herself she was allowed to reclaim without losing everything. That one conversation didn't create their problems. It simply named them. And once something is named, you can't pretend it isn't there anymore. In the months and years that followed, the split between them widened in ways both loud and quiet. On the surface, their lives carried on. There were still public appearances, family photos, glimpses of them together that let the world believe the fairy tale was intact. Fans saw what they wanted to see. The king and his queen, the parents of a beautiful little girl, the golden couple of rock and roll mythology. Behind closed doors, the picture was very different. Priscilla's attempts at independence grew more deliberate. She was no longer content to be just an accessory in Elvis' story. The conversation about his regret had jolted something awake in her. If he could admit that their marriage might have been a mistake forced by the life around them, then what did that say about the way she had been living? She started to ask herself questions she had been too afraid to voice. Who am I if I'm not his wife? What do I want beyond keeping him calm, pleased, and close? What would my life look like if I stepped outside the shadow of Graceland? Small choices followed. A class here, a hobby there, a friendship he didn't introduce her to. A thought she allowed herself to finish without asking, what would Elvis think? To him, these shifts were unsettling. The girl who had once molded herself entirely around his needs was changing. She was no longer content to exist only in the spaces he left empty. And for a man who needed control in at least some area of his life when so much else was controlled by others, that was frightening. Their arguments became less about specific issues and more about something deeper. The feeling that they were growing into two different people who just happened to share a house, a name, and a child. He, meanwhile, was spiraling in his own way. The pressure never let up. The expectations grew heavier. The gap between the image and the man widened. The more he felt he was failing in one area, husband, father, stable partner, the more he leaned into the areas where he still felt powerful. The stage, the adoration, the temporary escape of being whoever people wanted him to be for a couple of hours at a time. The more he leaned into that escape, the less present he was at home. It became a cruel loop. The less present he was, the more hurt and isolated she felt. The more hurt she felt, the more she pulled back emotionally. The more she pulled back, the more he felt like he was failing her. The more he felt he was failing, the deeper he went into self-destruction. In that loop, love existed, but it was buried under layers of pain, resentment, and unspoken grief. Eventually, the quiet rebellion she'd started inside herself turned into actions that couldn't be softened or ignored. She sought emotional connection elsewhere. For the first time, she allowed someone who was Elvis into the most vulnerable parts of her heart. It was a line she hadn't crossed before, and crossing it forced her to confront the truth. She was no longer willing to live a life where her worth depended on his attention. When she told Elvis she wanted to leave, it wasn't a sudden outburst. It was the result of years of feeling both deeply loved and deeply neglected. Years of holding his pain above her own. Years of believing that if she just tried harder, sacrificed more, adapted further, everything could go back to how it was in those early nights in Germany when it was just a lonely man and a listening girl. But those years were gone. They weren't those people anymore. He didn't take the news well. To him, it felt like a betrayal and a confirmation of his worst fears rolled into one. On one hand, he felt abandoned. On the other, he saw with brutal clarity what he had done to push her to this point. The man who once said, "I should have never dragged you into this," was now being faced with the natural consequence of that admission. She was walking out of this, out of the chaos, out of the cage, out of the role she had played so faithfully for so long. Yet even in that moment, the complexity of their bond showed itself. They didn't explode into strangers. They didn't erase their history. They worked out how to separate, how to co-parent, how to remain in each other's lives in a way that didn't completely destroy what they'd built. There's a famous image of them walking down the courthouse steps together after finalizing their divorce. No screaming, no slammed doors, just two people side by side holding hands in a moment that marked both an ending and a strange, quiet beginning. To the public, it was confusing. Why were they smiling? Why were they walking together? If this was the marriage Elvis regretted, why did it look so gentle on the outside? What most people didn't understand is that regret doesn't always show up as hatred or blame. Sometimes it shows up as tenderness drenched in sadness, as the realization that you loved someone and still managed to break the place where that love lived. For Elvis, the aftermath of the divorce was a mirror he couldn't easily look away from. He called Priscilla. He leaned on her. He turned to her for advice, comfort, familiarity. Friends and family have often said that she remained one of the few people who could speak truth to him, who knew the man under the myth well enough to reach him when others couldn't. For Priscilla, those calls were both a balm and a fresh wound every time. She had freed herself from the daily grind of being his wife, but she had not freed herself from caring about him. How could she? He was the father of her child. He was the boy who had once poured his heart out to her in a foreign land. He was the man who had changed the entire course of her life, both for better and for worse. His decline in those final years was painful to watch. The world saw a superstar gaining weight, canceling shows, looking tired on stage. She saw a man crumbling under the weight of unresolved grief, addiction, and the emptiness that had always followed him when the spotlight dimmed. Did he die still regretting the marriage? Or did he, by then, regret more the ways he had failed the people he loved? Those are questions only he could have truly answered, and he's not here to answer them. What Priscilla has, all these decades later, are fragments. Fragments of tenderness, fragments of cruelty, fragments of quiet, late-night confessions like the one where he said he wondered if they should have ever gotten married. For years, she kept that fragment to herself. She didn't want to hand tabloids a weapon. She didn't want to hand angry fans a reason to rewrite her as the cause of his pain. She didn't want their daughter to grow up with that sentence echoing louder than all the times Elvis said he loved them. So she buried it. She protected his legacy even at the cost of her own peace. She let people think what they wanted, that she was the lucky girl who caught the king, that she was the one who hurt him by leaving, that the regret, if there was any, all sat on her side of the story. Only when time had passed, when the noise had quieted, when the people who might twist her words had either faded or died, when she herself had lived a full life beyond the gates of Graceland, did she begin to speak about that moment more openly. Not to tear him down, but to tell her truth. At 78, she can finally say, without flinching, that there was a night when Elvis Presley looked at her and admitted he did not believe he was built for a normal marriage, that he questioned whether they should have ever formalized their love under the crushing weight of his fame. And at 78, she can also say something else, that she does not believe he regretted loving her. What he regretted in her eyes was failing to protect her from the storm that came with him, failing to be the husband he had wanted to be, failing to keep their world from collapsing under pressures they did not create, but still had to live through. For fans, hearing that kind of nuance is uncomfortable. It's easier to pick a side, to either canonize the love story as perfect or condemn it as a lie. But real life doesn't work like that. Real life is messy, contradictory, full of people who can love deeply and still cause tremendous harm. Priscilla knows that better than anyone. And that's why, when she finally speaks now, it doesn't sound like an accusation. It sounds like a woman who has spent decades trying to make peace with the fact that the greatest romance of her life was also the cage she had to eventually escape. The marriage Elvis regretted was not just about paperwork or a ceremony. It was about everything that came with it. The image, the expectations, the promises he couldn't keep, the pain he caused without always meaning to. The cost she paid without fully understanding what she was signing up for. And as we move forward, as we look at what all of this means for Elvis' legacy, for Priscilla's story, and for the fans who still cling to that wedding photo as proof of a happily ever after, we're left with a question that lives in the quiet spaces between their memories. What do you do with a love story that was real, but not enough? For a long time, people tried to decide this story for her. Fans wrote books, critics wrote articles, filmmakers created their own versions of Elvis and Priscilla, sometimes romantic, sometimes cruel, almost always simplified. In those versions, she was either the girl who ruined him or the girl he ruined. The marriage was either a perfect fairy tale or a calculated mistake. But real life doesn't fit into those neat boxes. And that's what becomes so clear when you listen to Priscilla speak now, as an older woman looking back. She doesn't talk about Elvis like an idol on a wall. She talks about him like someone she knew in all his moods. The charming, shy, funny, wounded, selfish, generous, addicted, loving, and lost parts all mixed together. She remembers the late-night confessions and the careless wounds, the way he could make her feel like the only person in the world one moment and like a ghost in her own house the next. When she shares that he once questioned whether they should have gotten married, she's not handing us a weapon. She's handing us perspective. Because for decades, people have asked, did Elvis regret marrying Priscilla? But maybe that was never the right question. Maybe the real question is, how could someone living under that kind of pressure ever have a normal marriage at all? How could any person, turned into a myth before they were fully grown, figure out how to share a life honestly with another human being? When Priscilla talks about that conversation, she doesn't sound like someone who wants revenge. She sounds like someone who finally understands that his regret was complicated, that it wasn't, "I wish I'd never loved you," but "I don't know if I should have asked you to carry this life with me." And that changes how we, as fans, look at those wedding photos. It doesn't erase the beauty of the day. It doesn't erase the tenderness that clearly existed between them or the joy of welcoming Lisa Marie into the world. But it does add a shadow to the edges of the frame. You see the dress, the ring, the kiss, and now you also see a man who may have already been wondering if he'd made a promise he didn't know how to keep. It also changes the way we talk about Priscilla. Instead of just seeing her as the one Elvis married, we start to see her as a person who was chosen very young, shaped to fit into a fantasy, and then left to make sense of the damage when the fantasy cracked. We see a woman who carried not only her own heartbreak, but the responsibility of protecting his legacy for the sake of their daughter and his fans. She could have told this story years ago in a way that was harsher, messier, angrier. She didn't. She waited until she could speak from a place of understanding instead of shock, until she could see Elvis neither as a saint nor a monster, but as a man whose choices had consequences he himself didn't fully understand at the time. And in doing that, she gives us permission to see him that way too. Not as a god who never made mistakes, not as a villain who destroyed everyone around him, but as a gifted, broken human being who tried to build a life on ground that was always shaking. If you think about it, that's part of why his story still hurts so much. We want to believe that great talent always comes with great wisdom, that the people who touch millions of lives must have figured out how to avoid the heartbreak the rest of us stumble into. Priscilla quietly tells us they don't. Fame doesn't teach you how to love. Success doesn't teach you how to be present. Crowds don't teach you how to apologize or how to keep your promises at 3 in the morning when no one is watching. Those are things you either learn slowly, painfully, or you never fully learn at all. And maybe that's what his regret really was, a late, frightened realization that he never figured it out in time. That he had been given a heart big enough to love deeply, but not always strong enough to carry the responsibility that came with that love. Listening to Priscilla, you can hear that she has made a kind of peace with that. not a peace that erases the hurt. A peace that accepts that her life will always be tied to a man who was both the great love of her youth and the source of some of her greatest wounds. A peace that says, yes, he hurt me. Yes, he failed me. And yes, he loved me in the only way he knew how. And maybe, in her own way, she had to forgive herself too. For the years she stayed, for the years she left, for every moment she chose him over her own needs, and every moment she chose herself over the image people wanted her to be. That's the strange, bittersweet legacy of this marriage Elvis regretted. It forces us to look beyond the postcard version of love and see what it costs in real life. The sacrifices that never make it into the photographs, the late-night sentences that echo for decades, the quiet bravery it takes to finally tell the truth when the world has already written its own script for you. And it leaves us with questions that reach far beyond Elvis and Priscilla. How often do we turn people into symbols and then get angry when they don't behave like symbols? How often do we demand happily ever afters from stories that were never built for that? How often do we, in our own lives, ignore the cracks in a relationship because we're too in love with the picture of it to admit what's happening inside? You don't have to be married to a legend to understand that feeling. You just have to have loved someone who couldn't always show up the way you needed, or been the person who couldn't show up, no matter how much you wanted to. In the end, Priscilla's decision to speak out at 78 doesn't just change how we see Elvis. It changes how we see the girl in the wedding dress, the woman on the courthouse steps, the grandmother who still walks through Graceland sometimes and remembers both the magic and the pain. She isn't just part of his story. She is the keeper of it. And when she finally tells us that he wondered if they should have ever married at all, she's not tearing down the legend. She's doing something much braver. She's reminding us that even legends live and die as human beings. So where does that leave us? We're left with a love story that doesn't fit on a poster. A marriage that can't be summed up by one sentence, one photograph, one rumor, or one late-night confession. We're left with Elvis Presley, a man who could move an entire stadium to tears with a single note, yet struggled to stay steady in the quieter, everyday moments of family life. We're left with Priscilla Presley, a woman who stepped into his world as a teenager and spent the rest of her life learning how to step back out of it without losing herself completely. And we're left standing somewhere between the fairy tale and the truth, trying to make sense of both. Maybe that's exactly where we're supposed to be. Because if you strip everything else away, the sequins, the scandals, the debates over who did what to whom, what remains is something so painfully human it almost feels ordinary. Two people who loved each other, hurt each other, tried their best, failed in ways they didn't always understand, and left behind a story that still echoes decades later. Did Elvis regret the marriage? According to the woman who knew him best, he regretted the way it unfolded, the pain it caused, the way his world swallowed theirs, the way he could never fully be the husband he wanted to be or the husband she deserved. But he did not regret the love. And that, in its own fragile way, is a kind of comfort. Because it means that the smiles in those photographs were real, even if they didn't last. The laughter in those hallways was real, even if it eventually turned into silence. The feeling of a young girl in Germany hearing Elvis' voice calling her name was real, and nothing that happened after can erase that. As you sit with this story, maybe ask yourself, if you could sit across from Elvis today and ask him one honest question about his marriage to Priscilla, what would it be? Would you ask if he ever wished he'd chosen a quieter life? Would you ask if he understood how much she gave up for him? Would you ask if he ever apologized to her in a way that felt complete? And if you could sit across from Priscilla, would you ask her if, knowing everything she knows now, she would still walk into that house in Germany, still take that phone call, still board that plane to Graceland? Only they can answer those questions. We're just left to listen, to feel, and to learn. If this story made you see their marriage a little differently, if it made you feel closer to the real people behind the legend, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think Elvis truly regretted? The marriage or the way fame twisted it? And if you want to keep exploring the real, complicated lives behind the glossy images, you're in the right place. There are so many moments still left to uncover. Moments where, even after the divorce, Elvis showed in small, unexpected ways just how much he still cared about Priscilla and the family they built together. In our next deep dive, we'll look at one of those moments, the one Priscilla herself points to as proof that, even when everything was broken on paper, there was still a thread of love tying them together. Because for all the regret and all the heartbreak, at the center of this story, there will always be a boy from Tupelo and a girl who believed in him, long before the world demanded that their love become a legend.